Hey friends, welcome to episode 459 of the My 123 Cents podcast. Thank you for listening or watching over on youtube.com/My 123 Cents. And if you haven't already, subscribe to both the audio and video forms of this podcast. Of course, on the YouTube channel, you get a lot more content. I do some figure unboxings, some other random reels or shorts rather. Reels are, of course, over on Instagram and Facebook. And speaking of those, follow My 123 Cents or my personal pages, Kevin Huntsberger on Instagram and TikTok, of course, as well as over on Facebook. And speaking of Facebook, right now, a big contest of sorts going on the My 123 Cents Facebook page. As I am recording this on Sunday, show drops, of course, every Monday, but on Sunday, September 3rd, the My 123 Cents brand is celebrating or has celebrated its 13th birthday. It was 13 years ago, and I got to give props to my buddy Jeff Rose, who inspired me. He said one day, you need to write a blog, because I had dabbled around with blogs and stuff, and of course my fandom in wrestling, and he said, you really should get into blogging. And so I took the opportunity. I did it. It was a Friday night, sitting in my living room, and fired up the computer and went ahead and pulled the trigger and created the My 123 Cents blog first. And then a couple of months later, it was time for the My 123 Cents YouTube channel. And eventually, getting into the whole social media side of things and putting things out there content wise, I then luckily was invited by Greg Mahachko, the founder of the Jittery Monkey Podcasting Network, to join the Jittery Monkey podcast. And he had given me the option. There was a wrestling blog already here, but he said, do you want to call it the My 123 Cents blog? Or podcast. I don't even remember what the previous wrestling podcast was. It wasn't on for very long though. And I just really thought, I'm really trying to make this brand grow and expand. So I'm going to go ahead and keep the My 123 Cents name and call it the My 123 Cents podcast. And of course, through that, and I'm saying of course a lot, I apologize for that. Mondo the monkey was born and became part of the Jittery Monkeys that are already here. Of course, I did it again. Mondo didn't have a name at the time, but put it up for a vote on social media, and folks chose Mondo for the name for the My 123 Cents monkey. So I just want to thank everyone and remind you to go to My 123 Cents on Facebook. It's facebook.com/My 123 Cents. There is a pinned post there. It's a photo of a few wrestling DVDs, as well as an autographed picture of Ricky Morton, and then a Mondo sticker. I almost did it again. And I'm giving all that stuff away as a thank you for the support. All you have to do is answer the question that is on that post. It is, since it's My 123 Cents 13th birthday, I want to know who your favorite wrestler was when you were 13 years old. And for me, the choice was Kerry Von Erich. It was 1986, and I was a Hulkamaniac, but Kerry Von Erich, I just was totally. He's one of the wrestlers in the very beginning that kind of hooked me and got me, and started my fandom. So be sure again to go over to facebook.com/My 123 Cents, like the page, follow the page, but then also answer the question. And you don't have to be new to the page to win the contest. And someone actually cloned my page after I posted that and started telling a bunch of people that they'd won prizes. I've cleared that up. I have blocked that individual. When you clicked on the profile, it had 0 followers and was following 0 people. So that's a red flag that some page has been hacked or cloned in this case. And I don't know what their motives were, but some folks sent me a message and said, hey, is this legit? And I looked into it and of course figured out that very quickly that it wasn't. And I think we got it all, taken care of pretty quickly. So again, thank you for the heads up and thank you for the support. I'll keep that pinned post up for a couple of days so people can watch and listen to this week's show and react and respond to it accordingly. But since the podcast drops every Monday, and this Monday is a holiday, I decided to go with a Labor Day theme, if you will. And I don't think I've ever talked about this, at least in this kind of detail, about occupational wrestling gimmicks, but that is going to be the theme for this week. And I'm also creating something new to go along with this. For years, we've always talked about the Mount Rushmore of wrestling. Who is on your Mount Rushmore of wrestling? Who is on your Mount Rushmore of wrestling managers or tag teams or whatever the case is? So you're limited to 4, picking 4, which is good because it does make you really kind of get down and dirty and pick it. But I thought, one, everybody does the Mount Rushmore, and one of the podcasts I listened to, OVP, Our Vantage Point, the Retro Wrestling Podcast, they had a whole segment of Mount Rushmore and Death Valley. So their 4 favorite and the 4 worst, or the 4 best and the 4 worst. And so for me, I thought, well, I don't want to totally blatantly rip those guys off, and not that they have a trademark or a market on the Mount Rushmore name, but I thought to kind of brand it better, I'm going to go with the 6th Sense. Yeah, it's a play off of the word the 6th Sense, but it's going to be 6 because you add up 1, 2, 3 and my 1, 2, 3 cents, and you get 6. So I know if I have to explain it, it probably is not a good idea, but I'm going with it anyway. But my 6th Sense, the very first 6th Sense, is going to be my 6th favorite. And again, I did a blog about this earlier about favorite versus best, and I understand that my favorite, one of my favorite wrestlers of all time, is Kerry Von Erich. He's on my Mount Rushmore of favorites, but he's not on my Mount Rushmore of best wrestlers. You know, Ric Flair and Shawn Michaels, Bret Hart, you know, those kinds of individuals would go on best wrestler Mount Rushmore versus favorite wrestler Mount Rushmore. So I'm going with my favorites with this week's 6th Sense as well. And it is my 6 favorite occupational gimmicks. And I went kind of, there may be a little, I don't want to say controversy, but there may be some that disagree with whether or not this is an occupational gimmick or not. So I want to hear feedback. I want to hear input. And before I get into my actual list, I do want to talk about a few maybe honorable, well, I'll save honorable mentions for the very end before I reveal my favorite. But I will put this out there. The Undertaker would have gone on this list. The Undertaker was actually kind of the reason I posted on the My 123 Cents Facebook group, which is different from the Facebook page. So be sure to go and join the group as well, because I'm really hoping to make it an interactive community where people come in and talk and leave comments and post and promote things. That's the whole point of the Facebook group. So be sure, again, to come into the group and weigh in and let me know what's on your mind. But I posted that question about the Undertaker, wondering if the Undertaker was an occupational gimmick, because at one point you got, and there were arguments for both sides in the comment section, and I don't have it pulled up to read the comments, but I do thank those who did weigh in. And I, for a while, was leaning toward the fact that, yes, indeed, the Undertaker is an occupational gimmick, because his job is a mortician, or not a mortician, but like a funeral worker, you know, has the body bag, has the casket, has the urn. But the more I thought about it, I'm like, but the Undertaker was like a monster. He was always presented as the dead man, like a zombie of sorts. Like he had supernatural powers. He wasn't someone that went in on Monday morning after wrestling over the weekend and worked as an Undertaker of sorts, like from you know vintage times, from olden days, if you will. So I kind of talked myself out of the Undertaker being an occupational gimmick. So what do you think? Is the Undertaker an occupational gimmick, and should he have been included in this list? I'm acknowledging him, I'm talking about him, but I am not putting him on the list of occupational gimmicks. But I am putting in at number 6 his manager, Paul Bearer. Maybe, and this is kind of where some of the controversial stuff may come into play, is Paul Bearer an occupational gimmick? Well, I say yes. The name is obviously a play on Paul Bearer that comes to a funeral home and when someone dies and is part of that group of people who carries a casket out. So that's a Paul Bearer. But I always thought of Paul Bearer, especially in those early days, as being a mortician, a funeral director. He had a segment, a talk show segment called The Funeral Parlor. He was the host. So, you know, in a weekday, Monday, 9 to 5 kind of job, I would see Paul Bearer being the man at the funeral home when I walk in to greet family, loved ones, when they're coming in for a funeral. So I really liked the ghostly, ghoulish look and persona of the early Paul Bearer, and that character evolved too. I think that the longevity of guys like Kane and the Undertaker was essential to evolve those characters. And the Undertaker, of course, obviously went way off and became the American Badass, which definitely took him out of the occupational debate, in my opinion, when he was riding Harleys and wearing a bandana. Definitely wasn't tending to any funerals, and I don't think he was that zombie anymore either, obviously. So but I think the Paul Bearer character evolved as well and went from wearing the black suit and had the jet black dyed hair, the white ghostly face, and went more natural with his hair, and stopped wearing the makeup when he was managing like Vader and Mankind and stuff. So it was important to evolve the character, and I think that Percy Pringle, who I was a fan of back in the World Class days, but I definitely liked him much more as Paul Bearer, and think that in a time where wrestling managers were becoming passe and kind of going out of fashion and out of style in at least the WWE universe, Paul Bearer brought something to the product that is sorely missed, I think, still to this day. But just his relationship with the Undertaker, carrying the urn. Oh, my Undertaker! There's my Paul Bearer impression for the day. But I definitely think that he deserves to be on that list of occupational gimmicks, some of the best, and in this case, my favorite as well. Number 5, and I don't know a whole lot about this wrestler, but I wanted to use someone current because there's not, with wrestling today, it's not as gimmicky, obviously, as it was back in the 80s, when a lot of these, and the 90s especially, when these occupational gimmicks came along. But I'm putting Dr. Britt Baker, DMD, on this list because she's a dentist, a real life dentist. And by the way, Paul Bearer, the man, Bill Moody, who played Paul Bearer, was a real life mortician. And you're going to find that this list does have some real life occupational folks in it that translate into their wrestling character. But I am counting Britt Baker because AEW has leaned in with her being a dentist. They have made it part of her presentation. Now, whether or not it's a gimmick, I don't know if that's the right use of the word gimmick, but it's her character for sure. And so you see her, she puts on the plastic glove like the dentist would do. She uses that finisher, the mandible claw, she calls it the lockjaw, which is, again, a play on the whole dental industry. And she goes by DMD, she writes it out, DMD. I like that. I like the presentation of her. Again, I don't watch a lot of AEW. I don't see her on a regular basis enough to know, but I like, again, the way it's presented, and the way that AEW has leaned in on the fact that she's a legitimate dentist. And how cool would that be to go to the dentist on Monday morning after All In or All Out or Collision or some sort of AEW event, and then you watched her on TV and now she's working on your teeth. So I think it's cool. I imagine that as AEW grows in popularity, she may eventually practice less and less. I'm sure that has already become a thing for her. I don't know. But it's also an amazing career and a thing to have when you do retire from in-ring, that you can go back to practicing dental work and making a difference in lives there. So Britt Baker, DMD, is my number 5. Number 4, he wasn't really an occupation, I think, for part of his career, but eventually Brutus, the Barber, Beefcake. I know, a polarizing character maybe in the eyes of some folks, but, and this is obviously Brutus before, if you're listening, I'm holding up the LJ and Brutus Beefcake figure. This is before he became the Barber, but eventually Brutus Beefcake comes into the WWF as a heel, feuds with Hulk Hogan. In fact, my very first wrestling show live event was in late 1984. It was Brutus Beefcake versus Hulk Hogan in the main event. But in 1987, there's an incident on Wrestling Superstars where Adrian Adonis accidentally cuts Brutus Beefcake's hair right before WrestleMania 3. This sets into motion Brutus Beefcake's face turn, and subsequently, when Rowdy Piper beats Adrian Adonis at WrestleMania 3. It's a hair match. And Brutus Beefcake is the one to come back to the ring because he had wrestled earlier in the night with Greg Valentine against the Rougeaus, and there was an incident there as well. But Beefcake comes out full-fledged now babyface turn and helps to cut Adrian Adonis's hair, actually does a lot of that cutting. And so with Piper leaving the company, I think then Beefcake was, in a sense, going to be that replacement, that babyface, because Piper, I would argue, was the number 2 babyface in WWE at the time. And so Brutus Beefcake moves into that spot, comes out with the big garden clippers that have the paint or the tape wrapped around them to look like a barbershop pole. And he's Brutus the Barber Beefcake, and he beats his opponents with the sleeper, which is what Piper had used to beat Adrian Adonis at WrestleMania. So now that his opponent is unconscious, he then takes the opportunity to cut their hair. And the gimmick worked for a long time, and he embraced it. Again, I talked about it last week with Chad when we did the Terry Funk tribute episode. I think Terry Funk was the very first wrestler to kind of do something after his opponent was beaten and unconscious, when he would brand them with that branding iron. Brutus Beefcake, Ted DiBiase comes in and stuffs the money in his unconscious opponent's mouth. And Brutus Jake the Snake was laying Damien on top of his prone opponents, and now Beefcake is in and cutting hair, cutting and strutting, and it worked for a long time. And I liked it. I enjoyed it. I was part of that wave of fandom when Brutus Beefcake, and it eventually ran its course. Beefcake, of course, suffered that massive injury to his face in 1990, the summer of '90, when he was poised to win the Intercontinental Championship from Mr. Perfect, but unfortunately suffered that traumatic injury and was out for years before coming back in '93 to team up with Hulk Hogan once again. But in that time that he was off, he also had a talk show segment called The Barbershop, and probably less memorable than most of the talk show segments, partly I think because of the character. Brutus Beefcake wasn't always necessarily the best talker, but the most memorable segment of the Barbershop franchise, the Barbershop life, two come to mind immediately. Of course, the one being the breakup of the Rockers, where Shawn Michaels kicks Marty Jannetty and then runs him through the barbershop window. And then when Sid Justice went completely berserk and destroyed everything, and the shaving cream can blew up in his face. Those are the two barbershop episodes that I remember the most. But Beefcake, rode that wave for a while before, teaming with Hulk Hogan once again. Had a couple of comeback matches after his injury in the WWF, where he and Hogan wrestled Money Inc. at WrestleMania, and then I think they did some wrestling that was not televised as a tag team, the Mega Maniacs, I think they were called. And eventually Hogan leaves for WCW. Beefcake follows shortly thereafter, and he can't be the barber anymore, so he's the Butcher, he's Brother Brutai, he's the Booty Man, he's the Zodiac. Went through all these different gimmicks, but for me, the barber is definitely the best Ed Leslie character that was ever played, and one of those occupational gimmicks, because I could see Brutus being maybe not necessarily a barber, more of a hairstylist. With the way he dressed, he was a little more flamboyant in his appearance and his look, but I loved it. I thought it was again one of those fun gimmicks and occupational things, and cutting the hair at the end of the matches was just one of those unique touches, if you will, that gave wrestling fans something to be excited about. So my top three, I went back and forth on how to put these in chronological order of favorite to least favorite, and I think I'm going number 3 with this guy. And again, if you're not watching, it's Doink the Clown. It's my Hasbro Doink the Clown action figure. Clowns are occupations, and when Doink came in late 1992, it was something different. It was unique. It was, I think Doink may have been ahead of his time, quite honestly, the heel Doink at least. because he comes around in a time before the Attitude Era. I think Doink in the Attitude Era, and I would have loved to have seen it. There was talk of bringing Doink back during the Attitude Era with an edgier side to him, but I thought that the heel version of Doink was great, popping balloons, making kids cry. Now, obviously, things that a clown would not normally do, but it worked so well. And I think the biggest mistake with Doink, a couple of things happened. Matt Bourne, who played the original Doink, uh, and I do believe that there are wrestling gimmicks out there that can be played by anyone. And there are some gimmicks out there that really are custom made for individuals. The Undertaker, again, will bring him back into the conversation. Anyone other than Mark Calloway, I don't see that gimmick surviving and being as successful as it was. Another one with Goldust, Dustin Rhodes as Goldust. I don't think that you could have put the wig and the gold makeup on just anyone. Kane, Glenn Jacobs did a great job playing that character. And I think Matt Bourne was, pardon the pun, born to be Doink, but that evil Doink. And eventually, less than a year into his run, it was around late summer '93 that we get the face turn. And I don't know how long after that Matt Bourne is out and Ray Apollo comes into that role. And nothing against Ray Apollo. I other than him playing Doink, I don't know much about him, but I think that the direction the character was going, and then maybe not having someone as charismatic or as you know good in that role. And again, not knocking Ray Apollo, but Matt Bourne was Doink, and bringing Dink into it, and feuding with Bam Bam Bigelow, and making him the good guy. It just didn't feel right. And I know they've brought Doink in for different incarnations for different things. He's become kind of one of those characters that we'll just throw him out there for the nostalgia pop. And I pop every time he comes out because the character development doesn't have to be there as much as it did in those early days when Matt Bourne was portraying the character. But I always enjoyed it. I thought that, would we see the evil version of Doink out there at a kid's birthday party? No, because he was an asshole. But when he turned face and had Dink, yeah, I could totally see those guys coming to a birthday party, to a company picnic, to any kind of event, and making things better for everyone involved. So my number two, someone that I portrayed recently at WrestleMania, it's the Big Boss Man. Originally coming in as Big Bubba Rogers he wrestled as an enhancement talent in Jim Crockett Promotions, and then eventually became Big Bubba Rogers, and then went to where he was playing a bodyguard. Ray Traylor was playing a bodyguard. And it wasn't long after that Ray Traylor leaves World Championship Wrestling or Jim Crockett Promotions. I think it was still under the Jim Crockett banner at that point. Leaves in the summer of 1988 to go north to Connecticut, where Vince McMahon comes up with the Big Boss Man. I don't know if it was all on Vince McMahon, but he's obviously the final say. But the Big Boss Man, a prison guard, which Ray Traylor in his real life was a prison guard as well. The costume, to a T. The brutality, beating up his opponents. He would handcuff them to the ropes. He would assault them with the nightstick. In some cases, have the ball and chain and drop it on their abdomen. It was all, it was a great spectacle. It was, Boss Man for me was one of those guys that, face or heel, I loved him, because even though I didn't, I was still a Hulkamaniac in the late 80s when he's feuding with Hulk Hogan. So I took some umbrage with that. But his team with Hakeem and the Twin Towers, I really thought they were going to be the ones to dethrone Demolition. Obviously, that did not happen. But seeing that character develop and again, that evolution of a character in 1990, when he turns and becomes a good guy and fires slick, feuds with Ted DiBiase, feuds with Hakeem, eventually goes on to feud with Bobby Heenan and the Heenan family. So many great memories of the Big Boss Man. And I loved, they gave him then theme music, and it was more kid friendly, and he was, instead of making people serve hard time, although, when Nails came through in 92, there was some hard time being served there, but it was a kinder, gentler boss man, but still, having that same presentation. And I just really enjoyed the charisma that he had, and the just the way the character came off. And if you don't know what I'm talking about when I said my cosplay from WrestleMania this past year, Chad and I dressed up as the Mountie and the Big Boss Man, and kind of relived their 1992 SummerSlam 1992 or 1991, I'm sorry, feud. It was at WrestleMania in 1992. They were on opposing 8-man tag team matchup, but really just loved the Big Boss Man. He leaves WWF in mid '93, goes to WCW, wrestles as the Boss, then the Guardian Angel, and he had a couple of other gimmicks. I don't. Eventually wrestling as himself didn't seem right. It didn't feel like he fit, even though he was in WCW or Jim Crockett Promotions in his start. To me, he never fit that WCW mold, especially because at the time, they were early on. It was still kind of that cartoony presentation, even for WCW. I would argue. Hulk Hogan's in there and he's facing off against the Dungeon of Doom and those kinds of characters, the Shark and Brutus Beefcake as Zodiac and all these silly looks and whatnot. It wasn't until the NWO and that more realistic presentation that WCW was putting out there. But I say all that to say that, in '98, Boss Man comes back, but he has a new look. He is in all black and wearing the bulletproof vest, and is Vince McMahon's hired henchman, basically, and is more badass and a more brutal. I don't know why I said brutal like that. More brutal in his presentation and how he is taking care of business, so to speak. So that run lasted a couple of years, I think, and then the feud with Al Snow and cooking up the dog, but still having that prison guard edge was always something that I enjoyed from the Big Boss Man. And someone that we lost way too soon, died at I think age 41. Man, almost 20 years ago now. Ray Traylor passed, and I miss him. I think that he was, again, one of those great gimmick wrestlers, one of those all-time greats that I wish was still with us today, just to see what he would be up to. So I mentioned 5 so far. Number 1 is coming up, but I did want to throw a few honorable mentions out there. I mentioned The Undertaker earlier, not really being an occupational gimmick. So again, weigh in and let me know your viewpoint, your thoughts on that. Someone else I'm throwing in as an occupational gimmick, and there were a ton. Guys like the Goon and TL Hopper, who was a plumber. That time period of WWF 95, 96 into 97, it was silly when you think about it, and I never really got into any of those guys. But one that was around a little bit before all that was the Repo Man, who was repackaged. One time Crusher Khrushchev in Jim Crockett Promotions, then came to the WWF as Demolition Smash, who I loved the tag team of Demolition, one of my all-time favorite tag teams. But then when Demolition kind of petered out and went away, they had to find something to do, and for whatever reason, he was repackaged as the Repo Man. And I liked the sneakiness of the character and his voice and how he would, steal things and take things that weren't his. He was supposedly doing it in the name of being a Repo Man. In his vignettes, they show him out there repossessing cars and stuff. But was he really a Repo Man, or was he a crook? I don't know. And maybe that's part of the gimmick, part of the joke that I never got. But I did enjoy Barry Darsow in that role, much more so than other incarnations when he was the golfer in WCW and the Blacktop Bully as a truck driver, which, again, another occupational gimmick. Speaking of truck drivers, someone threw out Diesel being a truck driver as an occupational gimmick. It was talked about on something to wrestle with Bruce Pritchard. And Bruce was like, no, of course not. Diesel was, the engine. It wasn't the fact that he was a truck driver, which I get. I never once until Conrad brought it up thought of Diesel being an occupational gimmick. Someone else that I had on my list, which I don't really throw this in the occupational gimmick either. That's why I'm not counting it as one as such, but I wanted to mention it because someone may bring it up. That's Dusty Rhodes when he first came to the WWF in 1989, and all those vignettes they ran where he was a plumber and a pizza delivery driver and a butcher. I loved those vignettes, by the way. But when he came in and actually wrestled, he was just the common man. He was the American Dream. He was the common man. He wasn't necessarily one of those jobs, but just kind of portraying those jobs that common men and common women portray. And so I wanted to mention him at the very least and make mention as an honorable mention, but not as a true occupational gimmick. So that leaves us now, drum roll, for number one, and that is Brother Love. And Brother Love, who was played by Bruce Pritchard, who I just mentioned with the podcast. Other than Piper's Pit, the Brother Love show was my favorite talk show segment. I think that when you do those segments, it works much better when the host is a heel, is someone that is not likable, it's someone that's going to provoke the baby faces and kind of apologize and make excuses for the heels and cover up for them. And so it worked so well, I thought, on so many different levels. And I don't have a Brother Love action figure. I know there is one out now, but I do not have that. But I really feel like the character, we weren't supposed to like him, but I did. I liked Brother Love from the start. And, obviously playing a televangelist. And if you didn't grow up in the 80s, you may not know or remember guys like Jim Baker and Tammy Faye Baker, his wife, and Jimmy Swaggart. And they were just these larger than life, Pat Robertson from the 700 Club. They were these larger than life individuals that you'd see on TV, and they were always using religion to evoke emotions and then in turn receive money. And many of these people, Jerry Falwell also comes to mind. And I don't know the legalities of all of them, but I know some of them fell from grace and had troubles and whatnot. Now, Bruce Pritchard as Brother Love never came off saying anything about religion, was not a religious man or a man of God, but a man of love, and played that to the hilt. His white suit, his red makeup on his face, all the rings that he wore on his fingers. It just, to me, it worked. It was enjoyable. I loved him. And I think that it was just a very cool gimmick. And then eventually they brought him in and he was doing some stuff with the Macho King Randy Savage and Sensational Queen Sherry against Dusty Rhodes and Sapphire. They weren't necessarily wrestling, but Brother Love character would get in the ring and take some abuse. It all set up at the 1990 Royal Rumble, because Elizabeth had come in to manage or to be in the corner of Dusty and Sapphire. So, and then Brother Love, the talk show part kind of went away, and then he becomes the manager of The Undertaker originally back at the 1990 Survivor Series. And that relationship didn't last very long. They bring in, of course, Paul Bearer, which made a heck of a lot more sense. But, you had the light of Bruce Pritchard, the white suit, and then the darkness of The Undertaker. It made sense in those early days for that. And I really wish Brother Love, if he wasn't going to keep the talk show, would have stuck around in some sort of managerial role. I don't know who would have been a good fit back in the early 90s for Brother Love to have, but I think that there came a time where Bruce was kind of presented with the conundrum, if you will, of, either you're going to be a talent or you're going to be, behind the scenes. And he loved the creative process and wanted to still be able to do that. And so he chose to stay behind the scenes, which in hindsight is a good choice because I don't necessarily think the Brother Love character would have had the longevity that Bruce Pritchard behind the scenes has had in the world of professional wrestling. But again, my favorite. So, as a quick recap, it is Paul Bearer, number 6. It is Britt Baker, DMD, at number 5. Brutus the Barber Beefcake at number 4. Doink the Clown at number 3. It is the Big Boss Man at number 2, and number 1, Brother Love, with honorable mentions going to, again, the Repo Man, Dusty Rhodes, just for those vignettes. And are we counting The Undertaker or not? You let me know in the comments. Friends, thank you so much for watching, subscribing. Leave a review. Would love to hear from you. Want to know what your thoughts are, what you want to hear, what you want to see coming from the My 123 Cents brand as we close out 2023 in just a few months. And I have an idea. I'm working on some stuff because the last day of 2023 is 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. So it's the ultimate My 123 Cents day. And so we're going to have something fun here on social media. So be sure to check it out. Again, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, or X, whatever we're calling that these days. So again, check it out. Join the fun. Thank you for being supportive, listening, and enjoy the rest of your holiday. And if you're listening or watching after the holiday, have a great rest of your week. Thanks, everybody.